Hello, students. In the previous semesters, in accountancy and so on, you have studied the meaning of lease financing and hire purchase, etc. Lease financing is another important method of financing. Today, the second topic, we will study now the lease financing and the types, advantages, and disadvantages of lease financing. Okay. Now, just I over the text, which I am just lease financing is one of the important source of medium of finance and a long-term financing where the owner of the asset gives another person the right to use that asset against periodical payments. The owner of the asset is known as a lessor and the user of the asset is called as a lessee. Now, the periodical payment made by the lessee to the lessor is known as lease rent or lease rental. Under lease financing, lessee is given the right to use the asset, but the ownership lies with the lessor. And at the end of the lease contract, the asset is returned to the lessor, or an opinion is given to the lessee either to purchase the asset or to renew the lease agreement. So, different types of lease depending upon the transfer of risk and rewards to the lessee, the period of lease and the number of parties to the transaction. Lease financing can be classified into two categories: lease, finance lease, and operating lease. Now we'll see about the finance lease first. It is the lease where the lessor transfers substantially all the risks and rewards of ownership of the asset to the lessee for the lease rental. In other words, it puts the lessee in the same condition as he or she would have been if he or she had purchased the asset. That is the owner's position. Financial lease has two phases. The first one is called as a primary period. This is non-cancelable period, and in this period the lessor recovers his total investment through lease rental. The primary period may last for indefinite period of time. The lease rental for the secondary period is much smaller than that of a primary period. Now we'll see the features of lease financing. From our discussion, the features of lease financing, we can say the first one, the lease finance is a device that gives the lessee a right to use the asset. Secondly, the lease rental charged by the lessor during the primary period of the lease is sufficient to recover his or her investment. Third, the lease rental for the secondary period is much smaller. And lastly, fourth one, lessee is responsible for the maintenance of the asset. Next, fifth one, no asset-based risk and rewards is taken by lessor. So lessor here is not taking any reward from the leased asset. Sixth one, lastly, last is the type of lease is non-cancelable. The lesser investment is assured. Now we'll see about the operating lease. The lease other than the financial lease is called as a operating lease. Here, the risk and rewards incidental to the ownership of asset are transferred by the lessor to the lessee. The period of such lease is much less than the economic life of the asset, and thus the total investment of the lessor is not recovered through lease rent during the primary period of the lease. In case of operating lease, the lessor usually provides advice to the lessee to repair, maintenance, and technical know-how of the leased asset, and that is why this type of lease is also known as service lease. Now, features of operating lease, characteristics of operating lease, we'll see. The lease term is much lower than the economic life of the asset. Secondly, the lease has a right, the lessee has a right to terminate the lease by giving a short notice, and no penalty is charged for that. Thirdly, the lessor provides the technical know-how of the leased asset to the lessee. Fourth, risk and rewards incidental to the ownership of asset are borne by the lessor. And fifth, lessor has to depend on leasing of asset to different lessees for recovery of his or her investment. Now we'll see the advantages and disadvantages of lease financing. Now, advantages of lease financings in two categories. First, advantages to the lessor. First, it assures regular income. That is, the lessor gets a lease rental by leasing the asset during the period of the lease, which is an assured and the regular income. Secondly, second advantage, preservation of ownership. In lease, financial lease, the lessor transfers all the risk and rewards incidental to ownership to the lessee. Without the transfer of ownership of assets, and hence the ownership lies with the lessor. Benefit of tax. As the ownership lies with the lessor, tax benefit is enjoyed by the lessor by way of depreciation in respect of the leased asset. High profitability is another advantage to the lessor. The business of leasing is highly profitable since the rate of return based on the lease rental is much higher than the interest payable on financing the asset. High potentiality of growth. The demand for leasing is steadily increasing because it is one of the cost efficient forms of financing. Economic growth can be maintained even during the period of depression. Thus, the growth potentiality the growth potentiality of leasing is much higher as compared to other forms of businesses. Recovery of investment. In case of lease finance, the lessor can recover the total investment through lease rent only. That is lease rent. Now, the advantage from the point of view of a lessee, we will see. The first advantage is the use of capital goods, that the business will not have to spend a lot of money on acquiring the asset, but it can use an asset by paying small monthly rent or yearly rental. Tax benefit point of view, the company is able to enjoy the tax advantages on the lease payment, as the lease payment can be deducted as a business expenditure. It is allowed expenditure while calculating the profits. The third advantage is cheaper. Leasing the source of financing which is cheaper than almost all the other sources of financing. Technical assistance. Lessee gets some sort of technical support from the lessor in respect of the leased asset. Inflation friendly is another point. The advantage of to the lessee. Leasing is inflation friendly. The lessee has to pay a fixed amount of rental every year, even if the cost of the asset goes up. Now, ownership point of view. After the expiry of a primary period, lessor offers the lessee to purchase the asset for a very small sum of money. Now, we'll discuss the disadvantages. Firstly, disadvantages of lessor. We'll see. Unprofitable in case of inflation. Lessor gets here the fixed amount of lease rental every year, and they cannot increase this even if the cost of the asset goes up. So it is unprofitable in the situation of inflation, rising price. Now, second disadvantage to the lessor is double taxation. GST or sales tax may be charged twice. That is, first at the time when the purchase of asset, and second at the time of leasing the asset. This is the advantage, disadvantage of lessee. He has to bear the GST twice. The third disadvantage is greater chances of damage of asset. As the ownership of is not transferred, the lessee uses the asset maybe carelessly, and therefore there are great many chances that assets cannot be usable after the expiry of the primary period of the lease. Now, disadvantages from the point of view of lessee. The first we can say compulsion. What is that? The finance lease is non-cancelable, and even if the company does not want to use the asset, the lease is required. Lessee is required to pay the lease rental. It is compulsory. Now, secondly, ownership point of view, the lessee is not becoming the owner of the asset at the end of the lease agreement unless he decides to purchase it from the lessor. And costly is the third item, which is disadvantages. The lease financing is more costlier than the other source of financing because lessee has to pay lease rental as well as expenses incidental to the ownership of the asset. Understatement of asset. This is another disadvantage. As the lessee is not the owner of the asset, such an asset cannot be shown in the balance sheet, which leads to understatement of the lessee's assets. So these are the disadvantages which quite a lessee suffers from. So in this regard, the same topic, we will further discuss about the lease agreement, and we will see how these lease rental and all are being paid, and how to determine the lease profitable lease, whether to go for that or not, in our subsequent classes. Thank you.